And we are here live in Eugene, Oregon with SCI TV. I am Joshua Gordon, the founder of Sports Conflict Institute. I'm here with Dr. Ken Pendleton. Ken, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, my hope is we can be topical today and talk about the issue of bullying in professional sports. How's that sound for you?
Okay, let me see if I can give a stab at the incident that has led us to this subject.
That'd be great.
So, two players on the Miami Dolphins offensive line are inactive or suspended. The one of the players, Jonathan Martin, has filed a formal complaint against his fellow offensive lineman Richie Incognito, alleging harassment that simply goes beyond the normal, behavioral expectations for how pro football players treat each other. And Incognito actually sent there's a voicemail where he uses racial epithets and makes very vile threats, against Martin. And so the incident seems to go back to last year that Martin was a rookie, received more than the normal amount of hazing that rookies receive, and apparently, according to what we're reading now, some of the other Dolphins players actually did not like the fact that he was the butt of the jokes, and Incognito, who has a long history of problematic behavior, was exactly the kind of person who was going to administer the kind of hazing that Martin apparently received. And so the Dolphins now have a decimated offensive line, and they have what's going to be an attempt at a very thorough investigation of what is going on, in their locker room, and they have a very costly human and public relations disaster that is also probably likely to hurt them on the playing field.
And all of this is really playing out right in the public eye, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very unusual. I had to really search the sort of mental database to think of any other internal incidents between players on teams that have proved to be this divisive or become this public. And believe it or not, the only one I could think of, and please contact us if you think of others, but the only one I could think of was when Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers, where some of the white teammates were threatening to try to basically boycott playing playing with him, and that obviously was a very different motivation. And in this case, we have a much. It sounds like Incognito is a really bad guy who, at the minimum, needs a lot of help. But this issue appears to be a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think the only things we've seen in recent years has been a number of coaching incidents where coaches have been accused of similar type behavior, but they're in a position of power in those moments, and it creates a different dynamic. And often it's been happening for a long time before someone comes out in what we call a whistleblower role at that point. So we had folks like Lavonda Wagner at Oregon State University, who basically had reached a point where she had lost almost her entire team by the time it finally became public. So this seems to be an earlier one, and I guess one of the questions maybe we could start with, is that a positive or a negative in terms of helping to resolve this?
I think it's going to be a very big challenge for the Dolphins and for the National Football League to essentially deal with essentially a deep cultural issue. And what I mean by culture, let me just sort of point out some of the issues here. One is when the Dolphins signed Rich Incognito, they knew about his history of problematic behavior, and they may very well have signed them because they wanted someone with a bad attitude who could maybe bring that bad attitude to the football team. They didn't want a problem like this, but they wanted someone. They associate having a bad attitude or being problematic in some level with toughness, and they thought he could bring a toughness to the team they may have been lacking. This might have been the case with, allegedly with Jonathan Martin, who, he's actually getting a surprising lack of sympathy from some people because he's a 6'5" offensive lineman, and people believe he should have stood up for himself. It goes back to when you were a kid and you were in the schoolyard, and basically, if you go to the teachers, you've sort of lost on some level, right? And essentially, that's what Martin did. And it's like he's going to have a real problem repairing the relationship with his peers, whether he's on the Dolphins or some other NFL team in the future. Third, the NFL and the Dolphins are going to have a real problem getting to the bottom of this because I suspect that the culture that exists within the players is a lot like the culture in a police department. when someone goes to internal affairs division. They don't want to actually reveal any more than they have to about what's going on. So again, supposedly some of the Dolphins players actually were happy to make Martin the butt of their jokes. I doubt they're going to be very forthcoming about that fact in the testimony they have. And then finally, and I think this is the most difficult problem, is football. If you really looked at the big arc of the history of football, essentially they've taken a sport that's a very violent, one might say barbaric sport, and they've professionalized it and civilized it. But at the end of the day, when you play, you have to be hyper masculine and aggressive. And so a lot of the reason that behavior like Incognito's actually doesn't seem is deviant or loathsome or otherwise reprehensible as people think is because they think it's part of the normal culture of what goes on at a football team in a locker room. So you've seen interviews. For example, Antonio Pierce, he objected that he did it, as he put it, after 4:30 or 5 o'clock, that is after the workday had ended, but he said, look, many times in a locker room we use verbal and physical means to try to get a player to perform his best if we think that's necessary. So it's the thing that would be unacceptable at, say, a real estate firm or a marketing firm or, let alone in academia, is deeply part of the culture in sports, but especially in football.
Yeah, I would argue that it's likely a shifting culture as we've moved more and more towards professionalism in sports and commercialism. I think the expectations changed. We saw in Liverpool that they had a list of what you can and can't say in the locker room. We've seen the NHL come out against anti-gay language, right, in support of their right to play for homosexual athletes, right, and trying to figure out how to create a more professional environment in the locker room. And I think this is really, in some ways, the next episode of that. And at the same time, you also have to remember that both these individuals, in this case, are millionaires. How many millionaires go to work and are treated in that kind of way?
Right. I would say it's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
The only example I can even think of is Keith Richards hitting Ronnie Wood on stage during a rock concert if he was unhappy with how he was playing guitar.
Yeah, generally, with success comes professionalism, right? We don't see this as often, or we hope. Now, of course, there are plenty of incidents that happen in any corporate setting, but our expectation is that they should be addressed and dealt with.
Yeah.
But bullying in any workplace has become a very hot topic.
Yeah.
Bullying in sports has become a hot topic and often thrown around improperly. So there was a blowout football game a few weeks back, and the other coach was saying that it was bullying because they ran the score up on them. Well, I think if you were to look at the definition of bullying, you'd see that really what we're talking about maybe is unsportsmanlike conduct, right? Where it's just not good sportsmanship going on, but not really so much a situation of bullying.
Yeah, I think whenever you use those terms and you stretch them to that degree, not only do you risk watering down or obscuring the meaning of the term, but you risk then actually effectively de-emphasizing the incidents that really do need to be classified that way. And I think we should, when you use a term like that, we should have a very clear idea of what we mean, and it should really connotate something that we all would agree is pretty deeply wrong.
So Ken, one of the books I reference when it comes to bullying in any workplace, and let's think for the moment at least about the NFL as a workplace, and then we could challenge, some of the things that make it a unique workplace in there. But is this book called The Bully-Free Workplace? And I wanted to just share with you the definition and see if this is a workable definition for us in our discussion today. So they talk about workplace bullying being the repeated health-harming mistreatment of an employee by one or more employees through acts of commission or omission manifested as the following: verbal abuse, behaviors, be them physical or nonverbal, that are threatening, intimidating, or humiliating, work sabotage, interference with production, exploitation of a vulnerability, physical, social, or psychological, or some combination of one or more of those categories. So if you think about that as a definition, what do you think about this particular incident, and then more broadly about maybe what you know of the culture that happens in the NFL?
Yeah. Well, I think this seems to fall clearly within that. There seems to have been verbal intimidation, at least threats of physical intimidation. And it seems like this falls pretty clearly in that definition. The issue, really the challenge to the NFL comes with this deeply seated culture. So for example, 40 years ago, the Raiders had a guy named Bob Brown who was getting sort of, veterans were asking him to do this and do that, and he walked into a room and just unloaded a round into a mattress to one of the veterans. That ended the attempt of the veterans to try to ask him to do things like fetch drinks for him. Right? And believe it or not, that wasn't that, this is the Raiders, but they didn't just throw him summarily off the team for that. Right? And so it sort of speaks to the idea that it's sort of expected that grown men get to sort out grown men problems, and they didn't see the problem with what a dangerous approach this is and how quickly this could spin out of control, and especially in such, again, a hyper masculine environment. So I think we both agree that there's something that this kind of behavior is out of step with modern work cultures. We all agree I think we both agree that the football is, over the large arc of history, tried to professionalize and civilize athletes' behavior both on and off the playing field, and really sort of compartmentalize the places where it's appropriate to be highly aggressive and violent. So given that agreement, let me put this back to you and ask you a question. When you think of kind of conflict resolution models, what would you do if you were a general manager of the Dolphins, or if you were with the NFL, to try to think about how you combat these kind of cultural issues?
Yeah, first of all, in the particular incident, I would try and see what would be the most effective way and right process to use on the onset. Was it early enough where a negotiation could have been effective in trying to change the behavior, or was it really at a point where we needed to draw on power from either rights or going to the media or something like that? And I think right now, one of the issues is a systemic problem, which is there isn't very clear boundaries established by the NFL that set out exactly what workplace bullying would be defined as in this context. Mm-hmm. And really, it would be an interesting issue for the collective bargaining process to define that in a way that the players and owners are all comfortable to help professionalize this particular workplace in a way that still meets the goals and needs of an NFL environment. With that,
I was going to say, this seems like using a classic instance where if you had a formal boundary that was in place, you're told this is what's acceptable for hazing, right? Or here's what's acceptable. Let's not even use the word hazing anymore. This is what's acceptable for treatment of rookies. Mm-hmm. This is how we're going to also adjudicate issues that come up, which are inevitable among players in such a highly intense game where they're so interdependent, and really try to lay out sort of behavioral, the do's and don'ts, or the cans and can'ts, that it would really have given some kind of guidance in this particular case, to the players and to the coaching staff as well.
And I have to imagine that one of the upsides of this being such a public issue at this point is that there has to be some movement moving forward towards defining that in a way that folks are comfortable with. Because right now, the history was always that these kind of things happened, and they were dealt with internally, and they were dealt with as part of the culture of sport. But where sport becomes a workplace, and it really, at the professional level at this point, I think anyone who tries to think of it as something other than a workplace is holding on to a change that they don't feel comfortable with, but they're holding on to the past, and really things are changing here. The boundary around what's acceptable and unacceptable has to be shifting naturally, and then we have to think about, can we redefine it more explicitly as well. Certainly, you look, coaches in the past use all kinds of motivational techniques, and there's a whole lot of it still happening. You look at Bill Parcells with Terry Glenn when he was a rookie, drafted out of Ohio State, referred to him throughout the entire season as she. There's no clearer signal of emasculating someone than calling them she. I mean, the essence is drawing on that you are not man enough to be in this league until you prove yourself tough, play injured, play all these things. And yet these are at odds with some of the safety issues that are being raised by the NFL at this point with concussion management and hard hits and trying to protect players. It's at odds with the brand where we're trying to bring football into the lives of so many folks who aren't going to appreciate ultra violence as the only way to experience football. And then you have the real issue that these are folks who are being paid fairly well but are putting a lot on the line, and the expectation is that they can go about this as a business and be treated professionally and have expectations that will be the case. And some teams are doing that and some teams are not. And I think that's going to undermine those who want to argue that it's a necessity of the sport in order to win, because there are absolutely winning teams that do not allow this type of culture to permeate the locker room.
Yeah, and I really think that would be the second advice I would give to the NFL is I would actually go around and canvass and interview the 32 clubs, find out what their practices are already, so you can try to identify best practices here, and that might serve as your model for what you try to implement. So for example, we're hearing stories that the Steelers, for example, they really make sure they try to create a culture where, yes, they call people out when people do wrong, and they probably confront them in a way that wouldn't be normal in most work environments, but they try to make sure that there's safety mechanisms in place so that they don't ever undermine the ability of the offensive lineman or defensive lineman to perform at their best. Right? Jimmy Johnson, apparently, when he was with the Cowboys, he tried to here's what you can do with rookies. Right? They have to buy the donuts every day. Here's the other thing. Here's what you can't, and everything else that's out of bounds. Right? And so you're all of a sudden, management is sort of setting a very clear boundary, and then if you violate that, then you're violating it. Like, so you can compare that to what we're hearing about the Incognito case from the Sun Sentinel piece, is that the coaches couldn't. Martin had missed 2 off-season workouts. The coaches would be prohibited from communicating with him directly because they're voluntary, in theory, but really compulsory. And so they had, one of the reasons Incognito was asked to do this was because they wanted to let him know they wanted him at these workouts, and they probably chose Incognito with the understanding that he's the kind of guy who's going to be very persuasive and probably not in a very nice way, right? And so it's the very opposite of setting a clear boundary. Now they've essentially they've unleashed Incognito and told him get him to come to the workouts. And so you might be able to understand or be more sympathetic towards him, as hard as this is to believe, because he might have thought he was supposed to do whatever it took, including using really racist, vile language, to try to get Martin into, to actually toe the line, so to speak.
Yeah, beyond the idea of bullying in its own right, if you're looking for performance and you're trying to get all of your employees, all of your athletes to perform at the highest level possible, I think it's awfully misguided and ignorant to think that the only way to motivate athletes is through this hard, tough love. There are certainly folks who that is what they prefer and what they're used to and what they want. And there are also a lot of people who it's the exact opposite, a complete anti-motivator for them to perform in the way you want them to. So if you're looking for a lineman like Martin to perform at a very high level, this is probably not anywhere close to the way to get him to do that. And this might be a guy who you can motivate through a whole lot of other ways. We talked about this before in some of our teaching responsibilities, Ken, when we looked at Switzer and his relationship, right, in the past. Maybe you can even share that as an example.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of Michael Oher in The Blind Side. That if we take the film adaptation seriously, he was not a naturally aggressive guy, but he naturally has a protective tendency, right? And so Sandra Bullock's character, tries to really point out that you're not going to motivate him by telling him to road grade someone. You're going to motivate him by telling him it's his job to protect the quarterback. And I think the assumption that underlies all this that's incredibly problematic is we assume, I think the NFL culture assumes, not we, but the NFL culture, that in order to be aggressive on the field, which everybody has to be, therefore everybody has to be aggressive off the in practice and in the locker room too. And that's probably just not true. There are probably lots of guys like Michael Oher and perhaps Jonathan Martin who are capable of harnessing that aggression on the playing field if they're treated in a way that's consistent with what their personalities are in practice and in the locker room and their relationships with their teammates and with the Dolphins organization away from the game. And so a more subtle approach is probably actually going to get the best out of these players.
Yeah, Ken, there are plenty of attorneys out there who, when you put them in a courtroom in front of a judge or jury, that they are extremely aggressive, zealous advocates, and then when they go home or they're working with their colleagues in the workplace on a day-to-day basis, they're great collaborators and fun to work with and gentle people. I don't think there needs to be a natural sense that we have to be one way all the time in order to be effective. And to ask a bunch of adults in their professional lives to be aggressive in all facets of it, it seems greatly misguided. And I don't think it's as simple as that by any means, but there is this overwhelming assumption that that aggression is needed probably far more often than it really is.
Yeah, and so I think if we're going to summarize what I would, how the NFL should approach this challenge, I think that's probably the first part. They need to really question that basic assumption of whether aggression on the field, which everybody has to have, has to be mirrored by aggression in the other aspects of the person's life within the football organization. We suspect the answer is no. Second, they really need to think about how they can create as much of an understanding of where the boundaries are in terms of what's acceptable in terms of treatment of rookies, and in methods used to sort of self-critique and motivate your own teammates by both the coaches and by their other players. And then third, there should be very clear lines about what's going to be acceptable in terms of hazing and rookie treatment, because they're obviously in this incredibly vulnerable position, and this is a vestige of feudalism. This idea that you have to go through this hazing process in order to be let into the community, that's just very much out of step with the larger professional culture that the NFL is seeking to try to foster at this point.
Absolutely, and really when you're talking about team sport too, where ideally people are sharing the same interests in terms of performance, it really undermines that goal as well, and it should be no reason why the workplace has to be such a hostile environment. I hope and suspect the NFL is going to take this very seriously and look at this from a more systemic standpoint, not just as an isolated incident that requires its own investigation, but rather how is this enlightening to something that might be a far more systemic issue that they need to tend to.
Right. It's very tempting to take the rotten apple approach. But I think in this case you really have to look at it very deeply at the culture and really try to think about how they can prevent these kind of problems from occurring again. And I think as we just outlined, there's some real constructive steps the NFL could take. Yeah. And I might add college and high school football teams as well.
Absolutely. It would be great and easy and clean if you just said, wow, these two really had a problem with each other.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what we're going to learn as this information continues to come forth. I don't think it's the early indication at all. And quite frankly, we know too much about what's happened, in locker rooms for years to say that this is just one incident or someone who's too thin-skinned or any of this. And so my hope is that this does become one of those moments that makes us take pause and to evaluate this in a much more thorough and thoughtful way.
Yeah, that's my fear as well, that there's going to end up being two victims in this, and I don't want to excuse when incognito the things he said, which seem which are really vile, but they have to be placed within the larger systemic context of that of how the other offensive linemen, other teammates, coaching staff, and the general culture of football in the NFL in particular. And if you're going to actually try to prevent these kind of incidents from occurring in the future.
Well, this is great. I know we really, in some ways, are just framing the discussion, but I think even that helps us to be able to understand this in a little bit better way as well.
Yeah, no, I think I feel like if you just try to solve this anecdotally and use common sense, you're not going to get to the heart of this. This is a much more complex issue that requires a much more systemic solution.
Absolutely. Well, as always, a pleasure talking with you, and we will speak again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.